They called it a salvage job, as if the ocean were a warehouse and the missing item belonged on a shelf. In truth, it was a wager against pressure, secrecy, and the silence of 3 miles of Pacific water. The United States wanted to lift a Soviet submarine off the seafloor without anyone noticing, and then pretend that nothing unusual had happened. They would build a ship the size of a shopping mall, sail it into the middle of the Cold War, and write a cover story about mining the deep. And when a reporter asked the government to confirm or deny whether any of this had taken place, the government would invent a sentence cool enough to become a doctrine. We can neither confirm nor deny the existence of the records you seek. But before the phrase and the ship, there was a loss. In March of 1968, a Soviet Golf II-class ballistic missile submarine, K-129, failed to check in. She was diesel-electric, shark-backed, with 3 missile hatches cut like whales into her forward sail, and a crew that knew the taste of long patrols. Somewhere northwest of Hawaii, beyond the tight geometry of the Soviet Pacific Fleet's normal lanes, she disappeared. The call signs went unanswered. The radio room in Petropavlovsk waited, and then waited differently. Another submarine went out to search, then another. Ships crisscrossed the Pacific along imagined paths of iron. The ocean answered in its native grammar. No comment. The Americans were listening. They had sown the sea with hydrophone arrays, long gears laid across the shelf, cables leading to shacks where men watched pencil needles jitter. The sound surveillance system, SOSUS, had been built to hear Soviet submarines skirting the edges of oceans. It heard other things as a matter of course: whales gossiping, underwater landslides clearing their throats, pressure cracking rock. In that spring of 1968, the system recorded a brief, heavy signature, a metallic event at depth. Analysts at a quiet desk in a quiet building replayed the tape, triangulated the sound against other stations, and drew an X on a chart the color of old winter sky. There, they believed, K-129 had ended. Finding is different from lifting. The Navy had a tool for the first part, a nuclear submarine, USS Halibut, retrofitted into a photographer of the abyss. She sailed with cameras and floodlights and a drag arm like a metal fingertip. Days turned to weeks. The seafloor appeared in frames like moon photographs, each one a gray alphabet of sand ripples in geology, with small bright surprises: a scrap of metal, a torn hatch cover, a coil of cable. Then, near the coordinates, the shape lay where gravity insists things must lie. A broken submarine is still a submarine. Length, ribs, the logic of compartments. The images returned to Washington like postcards from a very distant relative. What they showed had value beyond propaganda. It was not merely a Soviet hull, it was an index of Soviet engineering. It was ciphers in metal. The question in the room changed tense. Not is it there, but can we bring it here? The answer would require dollars, audacity, and a story convincing enough to hand to the world. The CIA took the lead. The project needed a name and acquired several, as important secrets do. First Jennifer to label the compartmented security system, then Azorian for the specific operation to raise the wreck. The names were arbitrary by design. The work would not be. To lift a 1,750-ton object from 16,500 feet down, you need a hand that doesn't tremble and a spine that doesn't break. The ocean at that depth is cold and crushing, not merely heavy but insistently heavy. Every square inch of whatever you send down is pressed like a thumbnail into wax by a load counted in tons. The engineers proposed a solution with the arrogance that keeps civilizations interesting: build a huge ship with a moon pool, a hole through its middle like a throat, and lower a grappling claw to bite the submarine and bring it home. The claw would be called the capture vehicle, but people who love machines prefer poetry, so they called it Clementine. The pipe string that would carry Clementine down and back would be made of heavy tubular steel joined in sections, each section hooked to the next until the ship was attached to the bottom of the sea by something like a drilling rig built upside down. All of which required a reason for existing in plain sight. That reason needed to be louder than the truth and friendlier to headlines. And so the CIA went shopping for a billionaire with the right kind of mythology. Howard Hughes had a name that sounded like a diversion even when it wasn't. He owned companies that built aircraft and broke records. He enjoyed secrecy as a hobby. He was reclusive to the point of legend and flamboyant in absentia. The plan's authors imagined an offshore story so grand people would blink and move on. Hughes would mine the deep ocean for manganese nodules, black, lumpy ores the size of potatoes, using a purpose-built research ship, the Glomar Explorer. The hull would match the fiction. It would be a mining ship that looked like a mining ship, with derricks and cranes and a long well in its belly. The cover would be complete down to the last glossy brochure, diagrams of scoops and risers, promises of minerals waiting like treasure on the abyssal plain, a wildcatting future in which the sea made new millionaires. On paper, that is how lies work. In practice, it was also true. The ship would have to be exactly what it pretended to be, or the pretense would break simply by being observed. Meanwhile, in Soviet offices, the loss was still a loss. The K-129 families were told the usual things governments tell when the ocean refuses to give back what it has taken. The Navy conducted quiet ceremonies. Somewhere a roster became a memorial. Search radii widened and faded. Another boat, another season. The ocean allowed no answers and permitted grief to proceed in the usual order: disbelief, anger, routine. The Americans built their ship in a shipyard where men signed extra papers and learned to enjoy the taste of not asking. The Hughes Glomar Explorer was long and boxy, with structural beams you could drive a car through. On deck, a towering derrick suggested oil work. Below, the moon pool gave the sea a doorway into the ship's center. Beneath the ship, a capture barge would be hidden and then brought to the surface like a magician's secret compartment. The machinery had the beauty of extreme purpose: huge winches to control the pipe string, guidance systems to keep the hull steady over a particular latitude and longitude, and a mechanical hand complex enough to make a watchmaker smile. In drawings, Clementine looked like an arthropod: jointed arms, pads that would slide under the submarine's hull, fingers thick as pillars that would curl and lock. Then there was logistics. A pipe string long enough to reach the bottom meant thousands of tons of steel hanging from the ship's throat. The weight would shift with the sea's opinion of the day, meaning the Glomar needed a dynamic positioning system, clever enough to stay within a tight circle in a messy world. The ship could not yaw or drift during the lift. Any oscillation would turn the pipe into a pendulum and the claw into a wrecking ball. The engineers built intolerances and redundancies, and then built backups for the redundancies. The budgets expanded the way stories expand when told in rooms that value urgency more than thrift. At headquarters, the planners stitched other layers onto the cover. They announced the mining venture. They registered a company. They let the trade press see what it expected to see. And then they wrote the rules of silence around the parts that mattered. The crew would be compartmentalized. Some would believe they were prospecting. Some would know they were fishing for a submarine. A navigator might know more than a crane operator. Pilots who moved men and parts in and out of Hawaii would be told what they needed to get airborne and no more. Even the public relations materials had their own version of compartmentalization, impressive enough to stand up in the daylight, vague enough to keep eyes off the shadows. Hughes' name smoothed the edges wherever the project touched the everyday world. When the Glomar crew asked for harbor space or priority servicing, they did so with the aura of a billionaire's experiment and the quasi-religious respect that attaches to resource extraction, minerals, technology, the future. No one likes to be the official who denies the future a parking place. In July 1974, the ship steamed to the recovery site under a sun no one could falsify. The Pacific wore its summer face. Below, the water was still winter. The Glomar cut its engines and let the dynamic positioning thrusters mutter to themselves, keeping the bow pointed where the math wanted it pointed. The crew began to run pipe. Each 40-foot segment lifted, aligned, threaded, and lowered into the throat. The repetitive process would have looked dull if the numbers attached to it had not been so strange. As the string lengthened, the ship rose imperceptibly on the sea under the difference between now and an hour ago. There was motion at the edge of perception, a tone in metal, a different posture in the cables. At the end of the pipe came Clementine, and after Clementine came the bottom. The claw spread its arms and groped for the submarine like a bat that sees with its hands. The pilots watched on remote cameras dimmed by distance and particles. Patience was a tool. Precision was a prayer. When the arms finally slid under the whole section the team aimed to capture, there must have been a pause that felt like a cliff edge. Then the claw closed. The load shifted from earth to ship. Very slowly, the winches began to take on weight. The first half of the lift belonged to physics. The second half belonged to chance. Somewhere in the dark ascent, under stresses the best calculations had respected but not fully mastered, part of the submarine broke free. The claw kept what it could, the sea reclaimed the rest. Later accounts, classified and then unclassified like a tide, insist that the Americans did recover a significant section of K-129, including a portion of the forward hull. The Soviets, watching with trawlers and spy ships beyond the horizon, saw a large vessel doing something puzzling inside its own choreography and pretended to be bored. The crew on the Glomar pretended to be miners performing an experiment. The world pretended not to notice a quiet ballet at a point on the map that previously had no dance. What came up? Hull, machinery, perhaps code books and metal bindings, perhaps the remains of men, went into the ship through the moon pool and into the hold like a secret box. There were protocols for everything. If they found nuclear warheads, there were procedures. If they found human remains, there were procedures. At one level, this was intelligence work, the gathering of information to better design the next generation of American submarines and to better understand the enemies. At another level, this was archaeology at great depth and with a political soul. The crew who handled what was recovered behaved with a form of reverence that does not depend on flags. Later accounts describe a burial at sea for Soviet sailors, soft words spoken in a language all ships recognize. And then they sailed away. A secret is only as strong as the people who hold it and the people who believe it belongs to them. The Hughes cover was good enough to work, but not good enough to live forever. Reporters heard rumors, strange movements in a Long Beach shipyard, unusual harbor logistics in Hawaii, a huge vessel that looked like a lie dressed as a ship. Seymour Hersh, a reporter whose nose for secrecy had once exposed the My Lai massacre, was on the scent, and so were others at the Los Angeles Times. Editors called government offices with questions that suggested knowledge no one outside the project should have. The government called editors back and asked, with bland urgency, not to print just yet. Lives were at stake. Operations ongoing. National security. These are big phrases, but newspapers are big animals. They listen, but only if the ask sounds credible. In February 1975, before the Glomar story could publish at full volume, another plot turned the screw. Thieves broke into the Los Angeles office of Hughes Company and stole documents. The burglary was noir and messy, the sort of criminal act that ends up teaching citizens more about their government than anyone intends. Among the papers were files that tied the Hughes Glomar Explorer to activities not easily explained by manganese. The burglars were caught. The documents became exhibits. Reporters now had court files to point to and fewer reasons to pretend they hadn't seen the elephant standing on the pier. The CIA pushed back at publication. The Times hesitated. The New York Times prepared its own piece. The story began to surface the way submerged things eventually do, first as rumor, then as a tipping point in a newsroom, then as a series of stories whose lead paragraphs had been rehearsed in private for months. At the same time, something else was happening in a small office with a big law. An enterprising journalist filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the CIA seeking records about the Glomar project. FOIA had teeth, but it also had exceptions. The agency replied with a letter that did not deny and did not admit. It offered a formula. The agency can neither confirm nor deny the existence of the requested records. The sentence felt like a shrug built from marble. It did the work of secrecy without the mess of lying. It protected sources and methods without explicitly invoking them. It treated information not as true or false, but as a category whose very existence could be secret. The phrase would be named after the ship, a linguistic christening. Lawyers and journalists would call it the Glomar response, and it would echo through decades of FOIA battles like a foghorn. Back on the water, the Glomar had concluded its mission. The equipment was stowed. Clementine, damaged by the lift in some tellings, was a veteran of one impossible act. The ship returned to harbor and to legend. The Soviets gritted their teeth in private. Publicly, they pretended nothing had happened, which is a cousin of what the Americans were doing with more flair. The value of what was recovered is a ledger partly redacted even now. Engineers will tell you that metallurgy gives up secrets under a microscope, The way a weld is made, the thickness of steel in a pressure hull, the alloys used in fasteners, the fatigue patterns in a hinge. Code makers will tell you that communication equipment is a textbook written in circuits. Anything with a serial number tells the story of a factory. Anything with a serial number obscure tells a different story, of procedures designed to survive capture. Even the missile tubes of a broken submarine are instruments. They describe the dimensions of fear. How many? How long? How accurate did Moscow imagine it was? What the CIA learned fed into a spiral of iteration, designed the next boat with the enemy's last boat in mind. Perhaps some cryptographic materials were recovered, perhaps they were not. The language of official memoir is a theater for ambiguity. But the certainty that the Americans had found something leached into the Soviet Navy's posture like cold. Their crews drilled new protocols. Their intelligence officers wrote memos with a different tempo. The other line in the ledger is political. The Glomar response migrated from one FOIA file to many. The sentence became a shield. Citizens learned to hear it with a mix of frustration and respect. After all, there are situations where even admitting that a record exists is tantamount to telling the story the record contains. But the phrase also took on a life as a cliché, a way for officials to hide behind the neutrality of grammar. Courts learned to demand more when more was necessary. Affidavits, in-camera reviews, a judge's skeptical eyebrow. The democracy learned to live with a tool that could be abused and could be necessary on the same day. Project Azorian itself leaked in layers. Decades later, declassified films would show the burial at sea. Sailors in dress whites, a Soviet anthem played as bodies were slid overboard and sank into the old cold. The ceremony looks like an apology from one set of professionals to another. It looks like honor in a gray zone. The film's release did what such releases always do. It fueled those who say we have told you the truth, and those who say you have only told us enough truth to keep us quiet. Both can be correct when the subject is a secret recovered from 3 miles down. Consider for a moment the audacity of the cover story itself. Manganese nodules do exist. The ocean floor is sprinkled with small concretions of manganese and nickel and cobalt grown around dust like pearls grow around grit. In the 70s, people indeed dreamed of mining them, sending down mechanical harvesters to vacuum up minerals. The dream had a brief season in trade magazines. Environmental concerns and the mathematics of price and distance eventually cooled the idea, but the science was real enough to make Glomar plausible. The CIA did not simply fabricate a world, it entered a world already half built by other men's ambitions. Good covers do not invent, they borrow. There is also a smaller story inside the larger story, one made of individual hands. The welders who joined the pipe string, the riggers who controlled the derrick, the pilots who flew crew swaps at midnight, the cooks who served meals in a room that pretended to be a mess on a research ship rather than a clandestine warship wearing a cardigan. The lawyers who wrote the Glomar sentence must be counted too, their craft as necessary as steel. Intelligence is a congregation of disciplines. The ship floated because men who had never heard the word Azorian tightened a bolt to the correct torque. If you draw the story's timeline from lost to answer, it looks like this. March 1968, a submarine disappears. Summer of 1968, the Americans find wreckage. Years of planning, building, and rehearsing later, in 1974, a ship goes to sea under a billionaire's flag and returns with part of a Soviet secret. The year after, journalists force the government to invent a new way not to talk. Decades after that, the public learns enough to be impressed and enough to remain unsatisfied. The ocean keeps the rest. At the center of everything is a strange tenderness. Men in one uniform recovered the dead of another and gave them a ceremony. Engineers built a hand to reach into darkness and, when the grip failed, they built the language to go on. Spies wrote press releases about mining. Editors agreed to delay printing for a time because lives might indeed be at stake. Thieves broke into an office and did the unintended work of transparency. The result is a story in which everyone played their part exactly as their institutions taught them to play it. And yet the outcome feels like an improvisation, a ship like a lying cathedral, a claw called Clementine, a sentence that is both honest and evasive. Stand on the Glomar's deck in your mind on the day the load came aboard. The moon pool is a dark square edged in steel, slick with the persistence of ocean. The air is a humid mix of machine breath and Pacific summer. Men in hard hats watch a shape rise that no one was allowed to name. The crane operator's hands are small gods. The winches pay out language that sounds like stress and victory at the same time. Somewhere below, in metal that remembers pressure like a dream remembers fear, is the story of K-129's last minutes. Somewhere above, in a Washington office where a picture window pretends to be a view of the world, a planner stares at a telephone and waits either for triumph or for a call that begins with the phrase, "There has been an event." And far away, in a city built for gray weather and patience, a Soviet admiral sits with his hands folded, thinking about sons and logistics. He knows the Americans listen. He knows they build strange things when they need them. He knows the ocean belongs to no one. He does not know that years from now he will watch a film of American sailors playing the Soviet anthem over a grave made of water. He will not know what to feel. What does Azorian teach, beyond the thrill of audacity? It teaches that cover stories work best when they are almost true. It teaches that secrecy and law evolve together. New operations create new phrases become policy. It teaches that the ocean is both hard and generous, a place where technology becomes a test of adults. It teaches that engineers can rival novelists in inventing worlds, one made of steel and thrusters and joints that admit no sloppiness. And it teaches that even when we know the outline, the details will always be contested because secrets die slowly. A leaked memo is a bone. The public makes a skeleton and then argues about the missing ribs. The Glomar response survived because it answered a need larger than one story. Wherever history brushes up against active operations, ambiguity is not a luxury, it is a duty. The sentence has been abused and has been essential. It is possible to say both and mean both. Citizens in a republic should learn to recognize the moment when a refusal to answer protects something real, and the moment when the same refusal is a habit of convenience. That discernment is not a clause in a statute. It is a civic muscle trained over years. Project Azorian, stripped of romance, is the plainest kind of proposition. Can we do this? The Americans answered with hardware, money, and will. Some of the submarine came up. Some did not. The intelligence gained was real. The legend gained was larger. The ocean kept the mystery center and shared its perimeter. For the people who worked the winches and the people who wrote the lawyering letters, that may be enough. For the rest of us, the story remains balanced on its best image, a giant ship pretending to mine peeling back a door in its own body to swallow a piece of the Cold War, and a government that, when asked to admit what it had done, quietly taught a new way to speak about silence.